It's a great joy today to welcome Dr. Matthew Kaemingk as our guest on Conversing. Matt is an assistant professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Seminary and also the associate dean for Fuller, Texas, which is located in Houston. And in addition, he's a scholar in residence for the Max Dupree Center for Christian Leadership at Fuller. Matt has previously published a book that got a great reception, which was entitled Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear, that was published by Eerdmans in 2018. But today we're going to be talking to him about a more recent book that he co-wrote with Dr. Corey Wilson, a book entitled Work and Worship, Reconnecting Our Labor and Our Liturgy. And I'm very excited to be able to have him as a guest and look forward to this conversation. Welcome, Matt.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is I've been looking forward to this, Mark.
Well, I want to start by just having our guests hear a little bit about you and about Corey and how two people whose lives have been out of a certain and distinct set of backgrounds. Each of you have parallel but different backgrounds, not academic backgrounds, and now both of you are knee deep in academic reality, and you're writing about the world of labor and work. So just tell us that narrative out of your story, and then give us at least a glimpse into Corey's story, and then how the two of you became co-authors on this particular project.
Sure, absolutely. So Corey and I both come from working class homes. My mother was a nurse and my father was a carpenter. Corey likewise, dad in construction. And we grew up working alongside our fathers. And worshiping alongside them as well. And as we moved into theology, we carried those working experiences with us. For me, as a young seminary student, I was brought in to New York City, where a church named Redeemer Presbyterian Church, which was pastored by Tim Keller, and there I had this unique pastoral experience of serving in their Center for Faith and Work, which is specifically focused on connecting young professionals in Manhattan, helping them bridge this divide between faith and work. And as a young pastoral intern, I was sort of thrown into the fire of discipleship groups with Christians in finance and Christians in fashion and Christians in theater on Broadway, and just as a pastor sitting with them as they would wrestle with what does it look like to be a part of the kingdom of God and to live out the gospel, to embody that gospel in my unique vocation. And I would say that as a 24-year-old seminarian, I was very taken that I did not have the resources to help or what I thought would be helping. And so I think very early on, I was haunted by these questions of faith and work, and very much haunted by the lives of these people who are really wrestling with what does it look like to form these deep connections between my Sunday life and my Monday life? And so I really carried those with me as I went on in theological education, and they never really left me.
And is that sort of the story with Corey, or was it a different story than that?
Yeah, so Corey, a little bit of a reverse. He began his MBA and sort of started his educational experience in business, and then was also felt called into college ministry. And so working with young people who are sort of at that nexus of deciding what their vocation might be, and who are also growing in their faith. And so this is a very common question for folks in college ministry, because young people are asking these questions of what should I do with my life. And so I think for Corey, that was really the beginning. And then he was also connected with a congregation that really embodied this in Long Beach, that really did seek to equip people not simply for a spiritual life of connecting with God, but living that out in their daily vocations. And so I would say both Corey and I, our theology was very much formed by churches that really impacted us at the very beginning of our theological careers.
Right, right. Corey, just for our listeners' sake, is now on the faculty at Calvin University and is doing parallel work in certain ways to what you're doing for Fuller. Each of you have your own academic specializations and areas of interest, but at least in this way, it's heavily overlapping. And you do share some deep theological commitments, which I presume were a significant part of being able to work on this kind of book, because it's a fairly specific theological tradition that I think has enabled and strengthened the value of the book. Just say a little bit about that for listeners to understand what I'm referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we both do come out of the Reformed tradition, which is sort of well known for caring about the priesthood of all believers, so that all people do holy work. It's not just pastors and missionaries, but we are all engaged in the mission of God. Oftentimes, people have this understanding that really it's only pastors and missionaries and nonprofit leaders who really do work that is holy and good. And it's sort of the job of the rest of us to give money to them and their work that truly matters. And so, the Reformed tradition has always put a heavy emphasis on that. However, our book is not full of Reformed theology.
Right.
And that is because there is a profound missing piece within the Reformed tradition. And this is what really brings us to our topic today, is that while Reformed theology really lifts up the priesthood of all believers, Reformed worship has historically been very pastor-focused and very word-focused. Yeah, very pastor-focused, very word-focused. It really does not engage the mission of the laity. And so Corey and I really had to look to a diversity of traditions and churches. So we drew on the Black church, the Latino church, Catholic tradition, Orthodox theology, really a wide variety of voices. So yes, we come to this as Reformed theologians, but it really was, we needed a larger communion of the saints to...
Right. Well, that's part of the richness of the book. And I certainly can say that in my own research and study, that one of the things that I think happened in the Protestant Reformation is that we, at least it can be argued, that we moved from a priesthood of liturgists to a priesthood of preachers. And though we had a theology of the priesthood of all believers, we haven't really lived out a priesthood of all believers. And the denigration that's often existed between the pastorate and, as it were, ordinary disciples is really one of the sad stories. And I think one of the reasons why this book has already gotten, and I'm sure will get, such a good reception is your recovery of that. And it's like the gap didn't theologically exist, but it certainly did in practice, because we have not actually put in place the kind of liturgies, as it were, that you're talking about in work and in worship that actually make these connections clear. So tell us a little about, was there a spark that brought you together around this particular issue, that maybe you were in a setting or you were having a conversation? I just like hearing sort of this, often there is a spark that motivates a particular project.
Yeah, sure. So it started with a number of problems, as books normally do. I was leading a discipleship program in Seattle for Christian professionals, many of them in the tech industry, working at Facebook, Microsoft, medicine. And we were teaching them about faith and work and helping them develop a theology of work. And this was a 9-month program that these professionals were going through. And from time to time, we would have a weekend retreat or a Saturday together. and we would need to develop a worship service. So it wasn't just lectures about faith and work, but we actually wanted to help them start to speak with God and practice really bringing their work to God. And we found that we didn't have songs and prayers and liturgies that were really engaging their working lives.
Right.
And so we needed something, right? And at one time I had asked Corey to come and lead a weekend retreat, and he started to teach them how to write your own psalm about work. And it was really through those conversations of needing to innovate a worship service for workers that really got us into this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great way to get finally into the argument of the book. So for those who haven't read it, just give us the shape of the argument, and then I want to investigate some of the details, because it's really such a compelling and urgently needed argument. So lay it out for us.
So the book really opens with a statement of the problem, which is that we are living our lives in pieces. You have your working life over here, and you have your worshiping life over here, and there's this great chasm. So we are living our lives in pieces, and those pieces are falling apart. So that is the problem, that work and worship are separated for us. And so then the question is, how do we begin to live holistic lives? How do we begin to link these things together in a deeper way? And it's at that, when we ask the question, we turn first to Scripture and looking at what Scripture has to say about these things.
Right.
And what we found was that what we were reaching for is not a new and innovative worship service. This is not a groundbreaking idea, but it's deeply embedded in the biblical witness itself. That if you go to the Old Testament, beginning with Cain and Abel, but throughout the Old Testament, people are continually bringing their work to God. They're bringing their grain and their fruit and their cows, and in the Exodus story, they're crying out to God about slavery. In the Psalms, they're crying out to God for rain. There's just this continual dialogue, and I think to myself that this is really something that's so profoundly innate to us as human beings. I have 3 little boys, and they're constant artists. They're always building things and drawing things. And whenever they make something, right, they're in the other room and they've made something. What do? They bring it to me, right? And they lift it up and they want me to see it. And they have profound pride in that. And that is this sort of innate human thing that whatever we make or do, we want to show it to God. And God actually takes delight in that. You know, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, these farmers would bring their fruit or their sacrifice, and the smoke goes up, and the language there is actually, it fills God's nostrils, and it's pleasing to God. You know, I think we often have this image of God as like with eyes watching us at work. But the Israelites had an image of God with nostrils, that he would take delight in good work. And so, you know, I would just say that as we went through Scripture in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and even into church history, we see a much richer tradition of workers continually bringing their work before God in worship. The beautiful things, the hard things, the laments, the praises. Worship was just much more connected to their earthy and vocational lives. And what we're experiencing today is a very modern problem. It's also a very Western problem. And so this is why we really turn to the global church, because what we found is, you know, profound examples from Nicaragua and Africa and the Philippines and Korea, of global Christians bringing their work to God in all kinds of really creative ways. And then the book really ends with some practical advice for both pastors and professionals of how they might begin to connect how they might begin to bridge this chasm, begin to bring their work to God, and we really use this language of gathering and scattering, that worship gathers workers together in the presence of God, and it gathers their work, and then it scatters them. It sends them to continue their worship out in the world, so that Sunday morning is not an isolated moment of worship, but it is the beginning of a whole week of worship. So as we do the benediction, the blessing and the charge, we're sending workers out to extend the table through their unique vocations in the world. So it's not an escape. Sunday morning is not an escape from the world, but it is ascending into the world.
Right.
So that's the overview.
Right.
And we can dig into whatever you like.
Right. Well, I do think that theme of being able to imagine gathered worship that ends, as I often tried to do when I was serving as a pastor, saying, now go and live your worship. That's actually what we've done here is worship. And what you are now going to go and do is meant to be worship. And there has to be a connection between these two things, which hopefully this service will have in some way or another strengthened, fortified, enabled people to be able to do. But I'm often aware, I was often aware as a pastor, still committed to these things, and all the things that we have done to try to strengthen that connection. It's just easily broken apart because of both reasons I think that Marx gives us over simply the disaffection of the worker from the fruit of their labor, period. And then on the other side, on a theological and Christian side, a sense of such hierarchy that one thing really matters and the other really doesn't matter. It's sort of small agency versus large agency. And the only large agency that works is spiritual and not material or physical or whatever it might be. So when you're trying to dismantle the problem and you're sort of breaking it down into various pieces, the book in the early chapters especially goes into some of the reasons why this has unfolded as it has. Just give us 2 or 3 examples of some of the brokenness of the theology that ends up causing people to feel not just separated between Sunday and Monday, but really like the two things are actually disaffected from each other, which I think is many people's experience.
Yes. So there's a lot of people to blame for this problem, right? We can blame pastors, we can blame professionals, we can blame the church, we can blame the world. There's plenty of blame to go around. And we actually don't spend that much time criticizing people. We just kind of take it for granted that this is a problem, and let's figure out how to address this. But it is important. Yes. It is important to understand the problem. So one issue, we can focus on the worship leader as someone who there are a variety of problems here with worship. One is that worship can be framed as a spiritual escape, as I said earlier. I can remember going to worship one time, and the worship leader, young guy with a guitar, very energetic, he just says, guys, I know you have all had crazy weeks. You're all so busy and your mind's going in a million directions. But for the next hour, we're just going to focus on God. And so the clear message was, don't bring all that stuff here. We're going to pretend like the week didn't happen. And God doesn't want to hear about it. That stuff doesn't matter.
It's a distraction.
Yeah, it's just a distraction from the things that truly matter. And so one problem can be the worship leader, the pastor. The other person can just be the worker who comes in and does not want to bring that stuff to God. The worker wants to have a divided life. They're very happy to keep their career to themselves. Thank you very much. I would rather God not meddle in my working life. And of course, this is an unstable way to live one's life and to grow one's faith, but nevertheless, that can be one of those things. Another is what we could say is the suburbanization of the church, where if you go back to, say, a church in the Middle Ages in a small French village, you would have the church in the middle of the village, and the market would be right outside, and the fields would be all around it. And so the priest, the church, the marketplace, and the field are all united. Wherever you work in the village, you can see the steeple. And the priest is always walking amongst you. And of course, the priest will do things like he'll pray his way around your fields, and he'll pray his way around the marketplace. That was a very common thing in the Middle Ages. But today in modern society, it's very common for, let's say, you to live in the suburbs and your church to be in the suburbs, but you commute into the city. And Leslie Newbegin argues that what happens is churches begin to just speak to family issues and personal issues. They become suburbanized, and they are very much detached from your working life. And so preaching is really about marriage, it's about child rearing, it's about personal lives, spiritual lives, but it's so geographically disconnected from the place where you work. So, that's another one. We could go through. Another one, of course, is just seminary education in general tends to have a very negative outlook on work and the marketplace as sort of a dangerous place of greed. And so, if work ever does come up on a Sunday morning, it is sort of talked about as an idol or as something that keeps you away from spiritual things. And business is just kind of looked at as a space of greed and temptation, not really as a space in which you might serve others or serve the community. So, there's a lot of issues.
I was thinking it would be a very interesting exercise in light of your book to sit with a select group of people from a church who would be really honest and watch the implicit and explicit statements made in a given service and evaluate it through these lenses. What are the gestures physically? What are the emotional communication links or disconnections that are there? What are the ways that theology is put to work to serve a certain kind of sacredness, but to diminish the sacredness in other spaces, not least in work spaces or in monetary spaces or whatever it might be? I think often people just really don't understand. We all just fail to understand frequently actually what we're communicating, despite what we think we're communicating. And to sit to read this book, which I would highly commend, and then to get a group of people together who are going to have honest conversations through a set of normal liturgical services that may have occurred, gathered worship events of whatever kind, and then just have it at it. Like, what is actually happening here? And what are we really seeing? And what are we really not seeing? It would be I think, a very, very helpful thing. One of the things that you say fairly early in the book is some things about how practices of the recovery of sacredness of work can be regained. And part of it has to do with how you're trying to help people to reclaim a sense of entry, how you begin your day, how you place yourself at the start of the day, seeing, embodying, moving around some of those workspaces. Describe a bit about that for the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started playing with this in Seattle with our faith and workplace ministry. And I think one of the things we discovered was you can tell people that their work matters to God, and you can give them a book that explains to them God is with you at work. But they still don't feel it on a Monday morning. They might remember it until 10 a.m. in the morning, but then they'll forget it, right? And it's not enough just to give people a book about faith and work, but they actually need a way to practice the presence of God in the workplace. And so we encouraged professionals to start developing little practices for themselves, little rituals to awaken them. And so we encouraged them to stop doing a morning devotional at home. And we encouraged them to begin doing some sort of spiritual practice either on their way to work or when they arrived at their place of work. And we encouraged them to develop their own. And so here are a number of examples. One is a doctor who she was very, very busy moving through the hospital and couldn't really stop and pause to pray, but she had developed simply the practice of placing her hand on the doorpost of the hospital room as she would go into during her rounds, just as a physical reminder to her, okay, I am entering into a holy place and I need to be present with this patient, as rushed as I might be. Another was a nurse who had been struggling with anxiety about these babies that she was washing and bathing and giving to these mothers. Sometimes they were in, difficult family situations and she would just get tense. And so she began to develop a prayer that she would pray over the child as she was washing the child and sort of bless the child and in many ways give the child to God as she turned to hand the child over to the mother. Another guy, he was working at Microsoft, which is in Seattle. It's a complex campus, so you have to swipe a key card as you move through the campus. And he had developed a little breath prayer for himself. As he would swipe his key card, he would pray. Another guy, he would take off his shoes under his desk in the morning, and he would say a brief prayer to remind himself that his office was holy ground. And I actually stole that one, so I do that myself in the morning now. It's a helpful little trigger for me. And so there's a number of elements there. I have more, but I'll just stop there. The elements are place. You need to do this in the place of your work. The second is body. It needs to involve your body. It can't just be an intellectual thing that you think or you say in your head. And then the third is that you need to make it yourself. It needs to connect for you. And then fourth, it has to, in many ways, for many of them, they connect it with something specific that they're wrestling with. So remember the nurse and her anxiety. We all have different sort of idols or vices and virtues in the workplace, whether it be our pride or our worry or our stress or our need to control. And so developing a ritual for yourself in the workplace that's connected to that, that's a big one.
One that I thought, for whatever reason, struck me was the story of the contractor, I think it was, who would walk around the property that he was going to be at. Say a little bit more about that example.
Absolutely. So this is a particular construction worker who works, at the work site. For him was a pretty toxic place, not literally toxic, but just the environment, the men that he was working with, just the culture was very difficult for him. And so it had been getting him down. He had becoming bitter, and he began this practice of just walking around the construction site in the morning and praying over it, and interceding. And, when we talk about the priesthood of all believers, one of the key things a priest does is the priest intercedes before God on behalf of the community. And, we learn in Scripture that Israel itself was supposed to be a nation of priests. And so we all have a ministry of intercession in our places of work, where we're called to speak on behalf of this workplace and bring this workplace to God, whatever its demons are. And that practice played played a massive role in calming him down and also framing what was about to happen there. That it was not just, let's get this project done on the construction site, but I have a priestly task here. And I'm called to pray for these men who are challenging to me, but I have a priestly calling here, and it's an important one. And that practice really helped him.
Well, I think it's an example, as you and Corey have argued this throughout the book, that what you're presenting for consideration is not just a set of ideas about how to better calibrate the meaning of how worship and work connect, but really this emphasis on finding the liturgies that are going to actually connect. This is why the subtitle, just to remind listeners, is Reconnecting Our Labor and Liturgy. And that liturgy is, as Matt's just described, both a personal liturgy at the workplace, let's say, and also the shared public liturgy that happens in gathered worship, whatever form, high, low, or otherwise, ecclesiastically speaking, that worship might be. I mean, I remember early in a job that I had in a secular workplace, how there was another Christian at this same place, and one of the things that he taught me that has been a lifelong practice, actually, that's part of what you're describing, is trying to always approach anyone I'm interacting with in my mind through the lens of saying, as he did, chosen, holy, and beloved. And so he would look at a coworker. Now, there's no way of knowing. In some circles, that language is preserved only for the church. I think in this co-worker's vision, that is up to God. All I know is I'm going to treat them as chosen, holy, and beloved. And if that's true of them, then I have to acknowledge that my instincts are going to have to shift in some way or another. And it's the importance of naming as an exercise of right practice, and right naming is part of right practice. So, I think one of the things that I found really stimulating in your book is the number of different ways that you're trying to help the church name workers, the workers name the presence of God, and the wider worshiping community, because there's so much, in a way, misnaming that's going on in each direction, largely around utility categories rather than around dignity, value, honor, sacredness, etc. Do you want to interact or comment on any of that?
Yeah, well, I think what he's reaching for really is that sacramentality of human beings, and then I would just add the sacramentality of the daily work itself, and creation itself.
Yes.
And so it really is awakening our modern dichotomized lives to the glory of God embedded in creation and in our vocations, and in the things that we do. And so this is not trying to conjure up a new idea, but awaken ourselves to an old idea that Adam and Eve, right there in the garden, are called to cultivate the garden. And as Jeremy Begbie says, we are to articulate creation's praise. So I'll use a very simple example. Imagine a tree, right? The Old Testament writers talk about the trees of the field are praising God. They're glorifying God. And if I were to take that tree and fashion a violin, work it, sand it, paint it, string it, that tree has not stopped praising God, but instead I have amplified creation's praise in some unique and new way. And so the tree itself is sacred, and the violin is also participating in creation's praise, and my work itself is a sacred thing. And so really what we're trying to get at here are small practices that anybody can do to awaken themselves to the glory of God in their daily work, so that a kindergarten teacher can look at 10 little kids who may be difficult at times, may be loud at times, but can begin to awaken herself to the ways in which those children are profoundly beautiful creations of God. And her task is to steward their flourishing and their own glory. And so what we need are small practices just to awaken us to that. And as we live in sort of a modern dichotomized world, it's very easy to become disenchanted. And it's not enough just to give people a theology book to live in an enchanted world. But we do need practices. And Sunday morning can awaken us to that if it's done well.
I remember when I was serving as a pastor in Berkeley that one of the things that was a practice from the start was that every year when new elders would come on to our session, the governing board of the church, I would go and call on all of them in their workplaces and try to just sit with them, walk with them, ask them just about the work, like the people, the work, the things that they do, the stuff that's being delivered or made or created or manipulated or whatever it is that's going on. And I found that it really changed my ability to be able to understand them that when I then was in a business meeting with them at the church, because I felt like just for myself, it was a point of deeper connectedness that I actually saw them in their primary workplace, just as they were encountering me in my primary workplace typically. And that was a gesture of that enchantment, right? That I could taste the enchantment of their world and want to hold on to that and invite it into our session meetings.
Yeah, and that's a pastoral practice that we need to continue to grow because there's so much more there. Now, just a short, example is I live in Houston, which is an oil town, right? And this year, oil prices have plummeted. And that has an impact on everybody, not just people in the oil industry, but everybody. People are losing their jobs, they're stressed, they're being furloughed. Now, the church that I go to, it's a lovely church with great pastors, but not once have we mentioned on a Sunday morning that oil prices are going down. Now, this is on everybody's mind every single week, but we never pray about oil. You can take this to any other context. Like, imagine there's a drought and you are leading worship in a farming community, or, fishing's been shut down and you're leading worship in a fishery. If Sunday morning is not speaking to, these vocational things, and that starts with pastors visiting people and learning to ask questions and showing curiosity. And when we begin that practice, it changes the way we do ministry. And that's just something we need to continue to grow in. And it needs to inform our congregational prayers. It needs to inform our sermons, the way in which we bless and send people out. You brought up elders. We have practices for blessing elders and sending them, but we don't have practices for blessing nurses. We don't have practices for blessing teachers, for blessing accountants. And that is something we're trying to call people to if we're really going to take the priesthood of all believers, seriously. That's just critically important.
Right. It's very, very important. I want to come back to the oil example for not to focus on your congregation, but because I think the practice that you're describing, or the absence of a practice that incorporates praying for oil, could be attached to many other kinds of purposes as well. But let's just take oil as an interesting example. So Houston is an oil-dominated city. It's the primary way that the economy has grown, and out of it have come many, many other things, but undoubtedly oil is the most dominant thing. Now, in some congregations, that would be a complicated thing to pray for, because some are rejoicing that the oil prices are going down, because what they really want is a gradual eradication of fossil fuels. And others in the church are saying, no, we want it to be strong because it's the only way that I can feed my family. Others are saying, I want it to be strong because I need more of whatever it is that they want more of. So it gets, even in its own way, a little complicated. Now, what are your theories about why in that case, or in other such cases of other topic areas, some of this is avoided? Is it a spiritual material division, or is it a more complicated set of divisions that are at play?
I think it's primarily avoided because seminary education just simply doesn't train people to think, train pastors to think this way or ask these questions or even consider this as an option. I think that's the first thing. I think, yes, obviously oil, there are all kinds of ethical, environmental, political things involved. But see, this is just the thing. Pastors can afford to avoid these questions,
provided that oil money still funds the church.
Yeah, but people have to work in industries that are morally complex.
Right.
Lawyers, teachers, business leaders, that arts, acting. Everyone else has to negotiate these things, and so pulling back as a pastor and not engaging them, you are leaving your people to negotiate these things on their own, and you're not teaching them to you're not teaching them to pray about it. You're not teaching them to talk with God about it. So Sunday morning can be the place where you actually help people develop some language to talk to God about these things, because I guarantee you, all of these people who are impacted by oil, many of them don't know how to pray about oil prices. They don't know how to. No one's ever taught them how to do that. And a pastor could. So, stepping back from these issues because of moral concerns is a luxury that pastors have, but it's not something that people have.
Right. Tell us then, on that same note then, what examples you found particularly moving, especially in diverse parts of the world, where you found liturgies or expressions that could somehow help with some of this? Because I thought that was actually one of the most unique and helpful parts of the book, because it's not just a North American mainstream white cultured approach. You're really trying to look at the variety of voices, cultures, languages, races, practices that are found. So give us some help with that.
Yeah, so I mentioned Nicaragua earlier. In Nicaragua, there's been developed a Catholic Mass for farm workers and street market workers. And it is a beautiful Mass, which is filled with songs and prayers and litanies, all around this theme of Jesus is with us. Jesus is with us in the fields. Jesus is with us in the markets. It is very much bathed in an Emmanuel type understanding of God with us, and a very sort of evocative language of Jesus is in the dirt and he's at the stall. Another would be in the Ukraine, there is a special apple harvest in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and it's connected to the Feast of the Transfiguration, in which, apple farmers bring all of their apples forward, and they have a great blessing of the apples and a feast, and they remember Christ's transfiguration, and it's very much connected with their understanding of the transfiguration of a seed into an apple. In Southeast Asia, there was a congregation that developed a song out of the experience of sweatshop workers, who in these sweatshops are given a number instead of a name. And there's a bit of a lament song about, it's called Call Me By My Name. And it connects with, God in the new heavens and the earth calls us by our name. And so it really connects with this dehumanizing experience of work. And of course, the African-American spirituals, which we don't talk about this very much, are very much not written in the church, but they were developed in the fields by slaves or indentured servants or people in Jim Crow South. But they are work songs in which people are crying out to God. Some of them are playfully undermining white domination and the master, and playing with this idea of master and Lord. but they are spiritual and they're economic. They are pious and they're political. And the African-American spirituals do not abide by the rules of dividing your spiritual life from your vocational life. They don't abide by that. And so those are just a few examples. Of course, there are many within the Middle Ages in Europe that are also quite fascinating. There are blessings of the plows that were done in Venice. Priests would bless the fishing boats before they went out. The first loaf of the season was used in a communion service. So all the farmers would come forward and they would bring the first loaf, and that would be a communion service of harvest. So it very much connected their working lives to the table, the Lord's Supper.
Right.
I remember we were working on this again in Berkeley at one stage, and we invited people to bring the implements of their work to worship and then bring them forward and place them on the communion table. And for a large congregation, that just meant it was just an unbelievable array of symbols of their work, right? And we realized that it was amazing and impressive in its own way, but that really we were not doing credit to the particularities. And the examples you've just given were the kind of thing that led us to then say, okay, really what we need to do is we need to break it down into certain categories. And then we would do it every month. There would be one kind of vocational category that people would bring their implements. But then we started asking them to bring actually the fruit of their work, if they could, which was not the same as the implements that were making it, but really kind of flipping it around. And I think it became a liturgical practice that did start having prayers attached to all of these various categories. And it refined for me a sense of how much the church in its own self-preoccupation has all kinds of nuance, but it has no nuance in relationship to work. It's just work as one lumping category, which does nothing to honor the value and the distinction of what each person's actually occupied with, and the challenges that are there. And we didn't do this, but one of the things that we were about to do when I left was to start inviting people who wanted to invite their co-workers to come to a service where people doing their work would be blessed, kind of like a blessing of the animals, in quote unquote. It's a terrible parallel, but you get what I'm saying. And it was a super interesting idea, and then we never got to it. But I have often thought it would be very interesting, partly because the shock of believing that, as it were, strangers to the church could be invited in for a common blessing, which of course.
Now I want to interrupt you because I think our listeners might think that, Mark Labberton, he has done some new and innovative thing by doing this. But if we go back to the early church, this is absolutely what they did.
Exactly. No, this is exactly right.
This is absolutely what they did. There is all kinds of evidence, and we lay this out in the book, of early Christians bringing all manner of crafts and food and all manner of things into worship.
Yes.
And the deacons receive these things, and some of them are lifted up in worship, and that's the holy meal. Some of them are distributed to the poor, and some of them go to serve the missionaries or support the missionaries. But they're all included in this sort of messy worship service. Right. And more so, you talked about sort of the blunt instrument that it is today. In some of the very earliest liturgies we've found, there is a specific instruction that when the worker comes forward, this is in the 3rd and 4th century, there's a specific prayer written, and the priest is to insert the person's name and then ask for a blessing on his home and on his fields and there's specific blessings for cheese, for olives, for grapes, and this is all written out. And it was very important that the worker is named and
yes,
then
yes.
the house and the work itself is blessed.
Yes.
So while people might think, oh, Pastor Mark Labberton, he's very innovative. This is a profoundly old thing.
Exactly.
That we've lost.
Exactly. And there's so much in this book that I, again, want to just commend to people. And though this conversation needs to come to a close for the moment, I do just want to say, Matt, how really, really grateful I am for this book that you and Corey have written, because I do think it's a book that I've already given to several different people who I think would not normally think about these things, who I think would think it wouldn't have anything to do with them. And because there has been such good tilling of the soil in this book, I know they will find themselves here unexpectedly. And I think that's part of in a way, the healing process that this book, I think, is also trying to achieve. So again, thank you so much for being a guest on Conversing today. And may God truly bless all of this work that you and Corey have done. It's a great gift.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really kind. And this really is the beginning of a conversation. So we, Corey and I expect to learn a lot more as the book is received and people begin to engage with it. And we're continuing to ask questions. So thank you very much for having me. This was fun.
Of course. Thank you so much.